Doctor Who has had so many seasons, so many different stories, so many different creative approaches that it's going to have its highs and its lows. Not everything it's ever done has been successful. But today I'm going to talk about what is, in my opinion, the most dejecting, discouraging failure in the show's 60-plus year history. And that is the tenure of the 15th Doctor. When 15 regenerated, I had never been more bummed out at a Doctor regenerating than this. And it wasn't because I'd grown completely attached to 15 and I couldn't bear to see him go. It was because it left me not wanting more, but wondering where the hell is the rest of it. And it's because we had this really incredible actor as Ncuti Gatwa. Excellent casting. And I don't think his tenure on the show lived up to even a fraction of its potential. Potential that is laid out in Ncuti Gatwa's performances. So today we are breaking down how Doctor Who completely failed the 15th Doctor. I really do just want to stress, none of my gripes here are with Ncuti Gatwa himself. He did the best he could with the material he was given. And whatever went on behind the scenes that led to his abrupt departure, he never phoned it in. He never gave anything less than a great performance, so again, none of my issues are with Ncuti Gatwa. Alright, let's get stuck in. Chapter 1. How By Generation Delegitimizes the Doctor. Before the 15th Doctor even got here, we have an issue. The title sequence, the TARDIS interior that would define his stint on Doctor Who, were all first discovered by David Tennant. We didn't get to see the 15th Doctor discover his TARDIS or pick out his outfit or get his sonic screwdriver. Heck, he didn't even get a main outfit, he just changed clothes every episode. Each outfit feeling more like a Ken doll's wardrobe than the last. The opening stories of this era that set the tone of Ncuti Gatwa's run as the Doctor belong to David Tennant. But worse yet, David Tennant doesn't even regenerate into Ncuti Gatwa. For the first time ever, a Doctor gets to stick around after regeneration. So this does lead into the question, like, does that mean that Doctor has just effectively evaded death altogether? Even though he was shot point blank with a deadly laser, like, what are the consequences? Like, how is his body repaired? But then that also makes this new Doctor here, the 15th, an offspring of that Doctor. It's not even like 14 passes the TARDIS on, 15 clones the TARDIS and gets to keep the clone. Now, of course, in a lot of MCU movies, there's always that joke question of like, where are the Avengers? Why don't they just call the Avengers? Doctor Who, with the Doctor being a singular hero, didn't really have to worry about that. Until now, where they just inflicted it on themselves for absolutely no reason. Meaning that one question hangs over all of the danger and high-stakes circumstances of the 15th Doctor era. Where's David Tennant? When Sutekh takes the TARDIS away, where's David Tennant? Why can't they just get in David Tennant's TARDIS? Is there a Sutekh clone on that TARDIS? Is this the original Sutekh, or is it another one? Did they clone Sutekh by accident? If that's the case, how did Sutekh get onto the cloned TARDIS? Now, you can show they've got linked memories all you want. You can do the whole we're doing therapy in reverse bit all you want. But to all intents and purposes, what the audience saw right there was the 14th Doctor giving birth to the 15th Doctor, making the 15th Doctor effectively his son. The 15th Doctor's very first scenes were shared with and largely focused on David Tennant. Did I mention this is the first full-time black Doctor Who? Optics! They need to be accounted for. A new Doctor has never quite literally within the show existed in the shadow of a previous one. But in this case, he kind of does, and it's unavoidable. People already have a huge predisposed attachment to David Tennant's Doctor. But if he's still around and he's still got a TARDIS, is he just ignoring the danger? But then what happens at the end of David Tennant's lifespan as the Doctor? Can he still regenerate? Would he regenerate into the 15th Doctor again, or would he regenerate into something else? And that's the problem we have here, is the Doctor is now number 2. It's like, okay, surely we can ignore this within his era, right? But then the Rani bigenerates. And the Anita Dobson Mrs. Flood Rani refers to the new Archie Punjabi Rani as kind of her offspring, even though for some reason she's now oddly subservient. And then when Archie Punjabi's eaten alive, Anita Dobson just kind of goes off and lives her own life. So if something were to happen to any of these Doctors going forward, there would always be 14 to fall back on. If Ncuti Gatwa's Doctor just died without regeneration, we could surely just pull focus back to the 14th Doctor and Donna. So what we effectively did, while embracing this brand new era of the show, is just off-screen reopened the door to the first Russell T Davies era. That's basically all still going on off-screen while the 15th Doctor has his adventures, and we're just focused on that now. So by generation already got the 15th Doctor off on really bad footing. You can have all the expositional dialogue in the world about how he's still the same guy. We still know the 14th Doctor's running around out there, and we saw 15 get squeezed out of his time Lucy. So to all intents and purposes, this is doing a disservice to this new version of the Doctor. Chapter 2. The 15th Doctor's ill-defined personality. Throughout the first season in particular, the 15th Doctor has two modes. The single empathetic tear rolling down his cheek, and the inspirational pep talk. Look how much he shines, he's so fabulous, but he's so sensitive, guys. This did at least improve in the second season, but a lot of the key emotional beats felt incredibly misplaced. You've got your Dark Doctor moment in Interstellar Song Contest, but the optics of that scene greatly detract from that moment, and he also showcases no kind of emotional reaction to the revelation of the Hellion genocide. Again, just making his anger feel incredibly misplaced. You've got the Doctor second-guessing himself for killing Sutekh while taking an unsympathetic stance towards Alan Budd, all because that episode just wants to make as much mockery of incels as it possibly can. But it's just like, yeah, the God of Death he feels really guilty about, but Alan Budd, a human being, he doesn't. 15 is supposed to be a mentally revitalized take on the character, far more in touch with his humanity. That was, after all, the purpose of keeping 14 around to look after himself. Yet 15 still finds any excuse to be distant with Ruby against her will. She's literally sad to say goodbye to the Doctor. She's not in some other dimension where he can't reach her. The Doctor has just, for some reason, come to the conclusion that you can't have both a best friend and a mum at the same time, and then bemoans to Joy and Anita that he's so lonely, despite the fact that this Doctor is meant to have an emotional clarity and openness that no previous Doctor had. That was the whole point, so why can't he still visit Ruby as a friend? That was a lesson 14 learned from Donna that has been effectively walked back with 15. So if anything, 15 has regressed from 14. That being said, there are episodes where the Doctor does feel like a far more consistent and fleshed out character, but I can only really think of two. Boom from Season 1 and The Story and the Engine from Season 2. With Boom, this was basically down to Stephen Moffat writing an approximation of 11 and 12, and you can tell. He's a very Moffat-coded Doctor in this episode. The only real difference here is all the tears, but even then, they do feel a bit more justified, as the Doctor's mortality is at the very forefront of this episode. In The Story and the Engine, that 45-minute story by a guest writer establishes more unique lore for the 15th Doctor than every other episode in his era combined. He's got a group of friends in a barbershop he frequents in Lagos, somewhere he feels included, but he's been betrayed by his pal Omo. Also, his ex-wife is there, so we've got the many emotions that come with that kind of concept, and they all feed into the story naturally. But outside of that, 15 just feels incredibly superficial. His overly affable buddy-buddy persona makes him come off oblivious to glaring moral issues staring him in the face, such as how he's all hugs and smiles with UNIT despite the fact they're breaking child labor laws, while with almost every previous Doctor, there was a bit more distance even in the Doctor's better UNIT relationships. UNIT is a military organization, not a family, and the Doctor treating them as a family just feels strange. And then yes, we have to talk about the Doctor's leaky face. The Doctor's tears did become a punchline in the same way SpongeBob's tears did, and I think it was season 6 of that show. Now, to be completely fair, while not everyone is a crier, the Doctor typically had valid reasons that probably would make a lot of people cry. But does he need to be placed in that situation in so many episodes from the jump? It all ultimately stems from Russell T Davies' mandate that the Doctor should be a more humanized character. In the classic era, the Doctor was typically a static character. The dude had a real sense of zen and conviction. With the first Russell T Davies era, we established that the Doctor was the last of his kind, a genocide survivor. They made his beef with the Daleks personal enough for him to have a convincing breakdown. We had the 10th Doctor weeping for Rose and fearing his mortality. That is how Russell T Davies approaches the character of the Doctor. And that worked really well for 9, 10, and even 14 by extension. With 15, we're trying to convey that same sense of humanity, but without the character flaws that made 9, 10, and by extension 14 compelling. The Wild Blue Yonder established the Flux as a source of trauma for the Doctor, akin to the Time War, and this would have been brilliant to see 15 overcome. But instead, 14 overcame it, off-screen, robbing 15 of a compelling arc. But it also speaks to the Doctor's confidence. When all of the terror is going down, and the companions are afraid, and the kids are behind the sofa, the camera just has to cut to the Doctor, and you know something cool is about to go down because he's not scared, and that instills confidence in the audience. And this makes it that much more effective when the Doctor does lose his cool or become upset in that first Russell T Davies era. The Ninth Doctor's horrified response at the lone Dalek holds far more weight because the Doctor didn't really display that level of fear and rage before that point. The loss of Rose is as emotionally resonant as it is because this very brave, confident figure that is the 10th Doctor doesn't typically display that level of emotion. It's reinstated by how the Doctor composes himself at Bad Wolf Bay versus when we see him alone in the TARDIS crying. Fast forward to Space Babies, the first episode of the first season for Ncuti Gatwa, and the Doctor is cowering at the sight of the bogeyman like he's a Scooby-Doo character. The episode after that, The Devil's Court, features the Doctor hiding in fear at the sight of Maestro. The episode after that, he accidentally steps on a landmine and cries. The Doctor effectively serving as an audience surrogate flatlines the tension in this show, meaning it all has to fall back on its metaphysical stakes. Is the world actually going to end this time? And then we make the circumstances of that so comedically dire that it's impossible to even care about that, so it becomes horrifying scenarios, horrified reactions, and a remarkably unhorrified audience. So there's just a complete flatline of tension across the board. No emotional stakes or metaphysical ones. Chapter 3. The Doctor's Relationships. Yes, the relationships the character has define them. The Doctor is always directly tied to their companions, and they define the character in a way. So let's see how this helping fare up. Ruby Sunday. The Doctor and Ruby's friendship feels like a secret the audience aren't in on because we never saw it develop. They hit it off immediately, then we time skip to 6 months later, and it feels incredibly cliquey. Russell T Davies writes the Doctor as human so the audience can get a bit closer to the character, but then has these two visibly fangirling over each other at any given moment for reasons we, the audience, don't really understand. But then, from the start to the end of Ruby's tenure as a full-time companion, they spend only 6 episodes together, with the Doctor and Ruby separated for the vast majority of 73 Yards, Dot and Bubble, and Rogue. And then there's Ruby as a companion as well. She is really nice, very friendly, good with kids, never holds any kind of grudge, immediately ready to forgive her mother for abandoning her before she even knows anything about her or the circumstances in the time window. Her entire character is tied to her feelings of abandonment and her wish to meet her real mother. Now, a great YouTuber, Stu Bagful, made a point about how adopted or abandoned children still tend to have tangible reasons as to why they would or wouldn't want to meet their biological parents. Reasons that might just go beyond curiosity. It's not necessarily just a given. And that's based on other people he knew who grew up adopted or otherwise. So when it comes to making Ruby Sunday's motivations believable and engaging, Millie Gibson is really doing all the heavy lifting here. She is the redeeming quality when it comes to this character. Like the previous Russell T Davies era 1 companions, we meet Ruby's foster family of Carla and Cherry Sunday, and once again the actors are doing the heavy lifting here. We see in the Church of Ruby Road and the Legend of Ruby Sunday that Carla has a big heart, and is just as forgiving and kind as Ruby is. But that's just 2 episodes. The rest are cameos or Elseworld stories where she's actually abandoning Ruby. We've seen her reject Ruby in just as many episodes as we saw her being a mother to her, and that's just... does pacing count for nothing? 50% of the pie chart is her being abandoned now. Which feels actually a little sadistic. But that's really all there is for Ruby's character. The rest is just directly tied to the series' overarching mystery. She serves as more of a story than a character, and heaven help you, show, that story better be good. But then for the second major companion, we've got Belinda Chandra. The story of Belinda Chandra is comedically awful, to an extent that I am convinced this was written to be deliberately bad as a piece of anti-media. Belinda rocks up in stark contrast to Ruby Sunday. She's less emotionally sentimental, immediately more independent. She subverts the fairy tale of the lucky girl picked up by the rockin' doctor. She's not interested in being swept up in his adventures or the charm. She's got her own life to live, and she just wants to go home, because she's an NHS worker who's tired as shit. The Robot Revolution might be a laughably shit-awful episode that's somewhere between parody and the third option, but it did at least present us with a fairly well-fleshed-out character, more so than Ruby Sunday was. She wasn't in it for relationships, love, romance, babies. She's committed to herself, and she's sure as hell not going to upend her entire life for the Doctor. They gave me hope with this character, and that's really the worst part because of what happens next. It goes from lazy to just straight up foul. So after episode 2, Lux, Belinda effectively becomes Ruby Sunday 2.0. The implication being that she was wrong about the Doctor, that she was wrong to reject being swept up in his adventures. Immediately, the overall messaging here is bizarre because, was she wrong for that? I think she was well within her rights and reasoning to just want to go home, back to the life she had made for herself up until that point. So to just revert her into another Doctor Who fangirl ride or die kind of sets a really weird precedent for the show's moral compass. But then abruptly, Belinda and the Doctor find themselves in Conrad's wish world. A world where all conform to the conservative ideals of capitalism, family, and traditional values. Because of this, control over their lives and narratives is actively taken away from the Doctor and Belinda. That's the big threat they are seemingly up against. So the Doctor and Belinda are now parents to the baby Poppy from Space Babies. Now Belinda loves Poppy, because she's been brainwashed into this. I'm not saying she couldn't come to love Poppy, but in this instance, she has been undeniably brainwashed. But the Doctor seems to think she's happier this way. So rather than returning her to her normal life that she made for herself, he regenerates into the time vortex so she can remain a brainwashed mother to this baby she otherwise wouldn't have had or wanted, as stated at the start of the season. So the original father was the Doctor, but in the new timeline the father is Richie. But Belinda is a single mother, meaning we've got 2 absentee fathers and the Doctor is one of them. Optics. Belinda pre-Wishworld and Belinda post-Wishworld are 2 different characters. There's a clear cutoff where the Belinda from the primary timeline vanished and this new Belinda's life was completely rewritten. In the first episode, she makes a point of being unhappy about the Doctor scanning her without her consent. And here in this finale, he completely rewrites her life without her consent. What the hell is this show's problem with consent? Playing into the old RTD playbook, Belinda does also have a family. She's got parents who we learn about entirely through expositional dialogue, to the point that when Belinda's mother finally did show up on screen, I went, wait, who's that? We only ever met the Wishworld version of her, never the original. And it's always at like the same timestamp in every episode where she talks about her family, like this is the part where the exposition goes. The show wants us to invest in Belinda and Poppy being together so badly that it justifies the Doctor regenerating, but Belinda has only been a mother to Poppy for 1 whole episode by this point. And in that episode, it's tied to the central threat of Conrad. So we haven't had any time for Belinda and Poppy to be that mother-daughter unit. It's trying desperately to recapture Wanda's wish to keep her children in WandaVision, except in WandaVision they introduced Wanda's children in episode 3 and are killed in episode 9, meaning their maternal relationship was actually tangible to the audience at the very least. I just want to throw in one more here, okay? Rogue. XD. That will sum up my opinions on Rogue. Rogue is effectively the river song to this Doctor and stands as a testament to how hasty and abrupt the Doctor's emotions are and how emotional beats are effectively just checklisted. The Doctor and Rogue fall in love after 1 single night. They have a little smoochy smooch, Rogue sacrifices himself to the Hell Dimension for the Doctor and Ruby, and then Rogue makes a cameo in Wishworld and the Doctor and Rogue confess love for one another. Also, Belinda touted on the Doctor to the Doubt Police, and that version of Belinda is now the primary one. But we never got any kind of closure for Rogue and the Doctor either. The last we saw of Rogue, he was a gay man in hell, and now the Doctor is a woman again. Say it with me now, guys. XD. Chapter 4. The Villains. When it comes to Doctor Who, you've got the big 3. The Daleks, the Cybermen, and the Master. And each Doctor has faced at least one of these big 3. Ncuti Gatwa has met none of the big 3. Even Paul McGann got to meet the Master, John Hurt met the Daleks, heck, even Jo Martin, who hasn't even had a whole episode to herself yet, has met the Cybermen and the Master. Now, I've heard people say, okay, but 14 didn't meet any of the big three either. And, well, wrong, because he was face-to-face with a Dalek in the Destination Skaro Children in Need short, and even though I wish that wasn't canon, it apparently is. But also, 14 is an extension of 10 who met all the big three. We're never going to see what a performance from Ncuti Gatwa would be like opposite any of these big three villains. These are characters that have all defined the Doctor over the show's tenure, and we're never going to get to see a Ncuti Gatwa performance opposite them. And no, guys, he's probably not going to star in Big Finish. He's off to Hollywood. He's got a big career ahead of him, so it's going to be very difficult to get on a lockdown for Big Finish. And yes, an appearance from at least one of these characters is essential. The Master defines the Doctor because he's the Doctor's equal, but he's also the Doctor's oldest friend. There's someone in there the Doctor is completely at odds with but wants to save. The Cybermen represent the people the Doctor couldn't save. The Doctor's favorite species, the human race, abandoning their humanity, abandoning what makes them as a species matter. And the Daleks are the one truly irredeemable species that the Doctor has no sympathy for. They don't just showcase the inner darkness of the Doctor, they're emblematic of it. But I mean, hey, the Doctor at least reacts to a Hellion in the same way he'd react to a Dalek, so that's the same thing, right? Classic Whovians, please sit down for a sec, because you cannot have Doctor Who without the Daleks. Not now, not in the modern TV climate, and not in this format. And you sure as hell cannot have a Doctor that doesn't get to meet the Daleks. You might bring up Paul McGann, but even if we ignore the fact that Big Finish gave him some Dalek stories, are you really satisfied with how the 8th Doctor's on-screen tenure ended up? Let's not make that the barrier of entry, yeah? So the 15th Doctor never met any of the 3 enemies that really truly define this character. Ncuti Gatwa is even clearly aware of this, as in an interview he expressed that there's really no point in being the Doctor if you don't get to meet a Dalek. You should have listened to him, Mr. Davies. Still, 15 does get to face off against some familiar foes from the classic era, and the idea of having a Doctor who doesn't fight the big three but instead saw other classic foes elevated to that kind of status might not be the worst thing in the world, but you gotta make those other villains worthy of that. 15's era brings back Sutekh, the Rani, and Omega. None of these characters are as defined as the big three, nor have they ever been as culturally relevant, but why not give them a chance? Particularly Omega and Sutekh, those characters could easily be elevated to solid returning villain status with the right stories. Even looking back at how the first RTD era approached the Daleks and the Cybermen, they didn't take the public conscience for granted. The Daleks were alluded to as early as Season 1, Episode 2, The End of the World, and we'd first encounter one halfway into the season, establishing the threat of just one of these guys early on, before revealing an entire Dalek empire as the big bad of the season. When the Cybermen were introduced in Season 2, it was again halfway into the season to establish them as a threat to their own parallel world, before making them a threat to our world at the end of the season alongside the returning Daleks. When the Daleks and the Cybermen would return for big event stories, it wasn't just the sheer surprise of their appearance or just how loud the National Orchestra of Wales was blaring at you. It was because we, as the audience, understood the implications of these characters from the jump. We experienced the consequences of a single Dalek infiltration before meeting the Empire. Cut to now, and it's basically point to an older woman on screen and guess which classic Who villain that'll be revealed to be in the finale. With Susan Twist, she was one of Sutekh's Angels of Death, and with Anita Dobson, that was the Rani. It really is just that simple. Maybe there's an anagram thrown in there like Susan Triad Technologies, which isn't even an anagram for Sutekh. And just to ensure you are super hyped, we'll have the villain's name get repeated somewhere, whether it's on the screens displaying Sutekh's name repeatedly, or the Rani's staff repeating the word Omega. Look, they're chanting the character's name now. Aren't you excited? Of course, Sutekh wasn't revealed until the very end of the penultimate episode, but then so we can have some understanding of the implications of this return, in the finale, the Doctor carries a portable TV around with him while he shows us clips from the Pyramids of Mars. But this also completely fails because Sutekh doesn't even resemble the older version of the character, as what was just once a manipulative dogman in a cell is now an eldritch horror with a surprisingly boopable snoot. Rani gets even less fanfare. After a season of "Who is this woman?" we abruptly got the answer in a mid-credits scene for a filler episode. And it's unceremoniously the Rani. And then she bigenerates. And Mrs. Flood, the Rani that got all this build-up, is nothing more than a servant to Archie Punjabi as the real Rani. What was the Rani doing all of that time living next door to the Doctor's companions? Who the hell knows? Why was she able to break the fourth wall? Why did she suddenly stop as soon as she became the main villain? Then the history of the Doctor, Mel, and the Rani is just spelt out via exposition over at Unit as the Doctor just fills everyone in. And then Mel literally tells the Rani, "We meet again." Omega is being bigged up over the course of the back half of Wishworld and the front half of the Reality War, and it culminates in him getting 3 minutes of screen time, bearing even less resemblance to the classic character than Sutekh did. It really can't be exaggerated how little there is in common between New Omega and Classic Omega. Omega was supposed to be made of antimatter. He doesn't have a body, and he's pissed off because he's the most historically important Time Lord, but he's been forgotten. And he's a petty bitch, and that's why we love him. He has a temper tantrum at the end of his first appearance. Seriously, we had an opportunity for Omega and the Rani to have a Lord Zed and Rita Repulsa Mighty Morphin style dynamic, but no, everything's gotta be a god now. Omega is a giant skeleton that eats people, and it's funny, because skeleton that eats people has literally been a trope in the Sunset City podcast for years now, and it's done for a joke. I should love this. This should be right up my street, but he bears absolutely zero resemblance to the character that we're supposed to be re-encountering here. So not only does this not hold any weight for the people who literally don't know who this character is, it doesn't even hold any weight for the ones that do. And these are all the main villains of Ncuti Gatwa's era as the Doctor. These are your replacements for the Daleks, the Cybermen, and the Master. The show generally assumes that you know them better than the original Russell T Davies era assumed you knew the Daleks, the Cybermen, and the Master, and now we've just brought them back and I still don't know them. Ncuti Gatwa's Doctor still faced some good villains, at least, such as Mr. Ring-a-Ding, the Barber, We're just gonna take a super quick break to thank the patrons. We've got Gosh Darn It, With Great Power, Just Another Evil Robot Clone Seeking Revenge, Xanderwolf, Ghostly Phantom, Twilord, KB, Sad Goku, Dare Daddy, Gail Bennett, Pop has at least $100 of my money. Not anymore, I spent it on bills. And Mr. SP, Cyrus the Skeptic, and Biotin. We've also got Press Play to Jason, Gideon Wells, Goober, Basic Content, Christopher, Reese Burns, Manalza, Goat Cannon, Litzy, Silver, Josh Strider, Grant Allen, Zach Brakowski, Coco210, Cho Henshin, RT0, Calex, SSO6, and Vera Wild. Thank you folks for your generosity, and now we'll proceed. Chapter 5. The Doctor's story is simply incomplete. At the end of the Reality War, the Doctor regenerates, 15 giving up his life so that Poppy can have a chance at her own. Except motherhood is now being involuntarily inflicted on a brainwashed Belinda. Meanwhile, Poppy, the baby the Doctor is regenerating so she can have a chance to exist, already existed in the original timeline anyway. The Doctor literally met her in the first episode of Season 1 as a space baby. And so the Doctor voluntarily regenerated for nothing. If anything, bad intent, because fucking Belinda didn't want this in the first place, and he's now just inflicted this life. Now, I don't want to come off completely unpleasable. There are things that 15's regeneration story, The Reality War, actually did quite nicely. The idea of the Doctor voluntarily regenerating to save Poppy is a nice one. The idea on paper feels fine, it's just that the stakes don't feel tangible. And then you've got the whole optics with Belinda. The scene where the Doctor and Belinda are folding Poppy's coat as it gets smaller and smaller until it disappears was a really good way of conveying Poppy vanishing out of their lives. Something really baffling about Reality War to me, actually, is that the second half, which is where all the reshot stuff is the better half. This will be the stuff that Russell T Davies was scrambling to write, so I'm willing to be a tiny bit more forgiving towards it. It's the first half that's just absolute drivel, in my opinion, and that's the stuff they planned. Maybe Russell T Davies works better under pressure, I don't know. And even though I wasn't a fan of Joy to the World, I did really appreciate the parallels between the Doctor's sacrifice and Joy's, and how he regenerates opposite her star. Didn't need him to yell the episode title at me, but like other than that, really nice scene. But you don't really have a sense of thematic cohesion. You've got that theme of family that carries throughout 15's era, but rather than these being cohesive themes that come together to create the story, it's just, hey, we acknowledge what I want to be the central theme in this story. All the ways the theme of family is acknowledged feel ironically divorced from one another, and in the end, divorced from the Doctor. We've got Ruby and her mums, the space babies and their nanny, the family of the Toymaker, Joy's sacrifice to be with her mother who died of COVID. We've got the unit family, the family unit, I guess you could say. And at the heart of it, this impacts the Doctor in the way that it gets him thinking about Susan again. And it all seems to be building up to this one thing. 15 is a mostly healed Doctor, and we see that him leaving Susan behind is something he's not at peace with. He talks about potentially going to find her, and he gives us a lot of excuses as to why he can't. He even questions if Susan Triad is his granddaughter Susan, which is just... it's really stupid. We get what appear to be visions of Susan in the Interstellar Song Contest, and another cameo in Wishworld, and then... oops, sorry, regenerated, I guess. Susan machine has stopped working. The 15th Doctor never met Susan. This would be like if 9 never found redemption in his choice to not use the Delta Wave against the Daleks. This would be like if the 10th Doctor were never humbled for playing God and never had to face his mortality. Wait a minute, wait, just a goddamn minute. 14's just undone that now, hasn't he? Great. This would be like if the 11th Doctor never made it to Trenzalore, or if the 12th Doctor never got to stand with Missy, or if 13 never got the chance to reveal her memories. Yeah, even The Vanquishers offers a more satisfying conclusion to its arc than anything in 15's entire era, which is insane, because that's The Vanquishers I'm talking about, which is just famously unsatisfying. Chapter 6. Was there any choice? So I get that there's such a thing as looking at this in retrospect. That's what I'm doing right now. The narrative that Russell T Davies seems to be running with is that this was always the plan for the 15th Doctor. He was always going to be a 2-year Doctor, and what we have here is everything his era was ever intended to be. Now that is complete bullshit. The reality war was 50% reshoots. Ncuti Gatwa spoke about shooting for a season 3 on the Graham Norton show, and he never met the Daleks. If it was always the plan to just have this Doctor never meet those very important characters, if it was always the plan to have this Doctor tease the possibility of a big Susan reunion and then just never follow through with it, then they planned for it to be awful. If everything I've outlined here today was always the big plan, how embarrassing that must be. It's obviously not, though. It's obvious that they weren't anticipating Ncuti Gatwa leaving so soon, and that's probably down to the fact that the show's future as it is kind of hanging in the balance, as there's a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not Disney will be renewing their financing agreement. There's a lot of uncertainty as to what kind of form the next season of Doctor Who will take, if it actually does take one. Yes, Ncuti Gatwa regenerated into Billie Piper, but there is no guarantee that we're actually going to see that come to fruition. That could be the last frame of the show for the foreseeable future. It could be that Disney agreed to renew their deal, but they want Russell T Davies out, and they get a new showrunner in who scraps all those plans. It could also well be that we've got a big green light on the next helping of nostalgia pandering from the Bad Wolf Brigade. But I think the plan was, for all to go smoothly, Disney to continue funding the show, Ncuti Gatwa stays on as the Doctor, and in that 3rd season, you'd reintroduce the Daleks in a big way, you'd build up to them. But in doing so, they had to effectively take Ncuti Gatwa staying on for granted, and his star was really rising even at the time he was first cast. They probably had a long game planned, longer than the time they had with Ncuti Gatwa. It's why I stand firm in my belief that the Doctor does need to meet the Daleks at least once a season, even if it's just little appearances like they had in the pilot back in Series 10. It's still a means of keeping them as a part of the show. It still shows us that side of the Doctor we'd otherwise never see, but it doesn't mean you have to have a devoted Dalek story. But also, a lot of this could have been mitigated if the show hadn't burned interest so early on. Chapter 7. Empire of Death. At the end of Ncuti Gatwa's first season is the halfway point. Empire of Death. Ncuti Gatwa's first finale. And this was a major turning point for the show. For me, this was the point where I stopped giving the new Russell T Davies era the benefit of the doubt, where my overall opinion that Series 1 was shaping up to be a fun, experimental, genre-centric collection of stories changed to it just feeling like a big waste of time. This showcased to us how mysteries and conflicts would be handled and resolved in this era, and managed to do about as bad of a job as you could possibly do across the board. We've got the Doctor resolving universe-ending conflicts by just dragging Sutekh around the time vortex with a slap-together equation without tangible reasons to actually believe that would even work. This would become a recurring issue with the Doctor regenerating into the time vortex to save Poppy. There's a lot of flashing lights on screen, but the only thing making sense of any of it is the Doctor just explaining it to you. Ruby Sunday, the untraceable girl. The girl who could make it snow when she's emotional. The girl with the forbidden song in her soul. Nobody could uncover the past of her mother, be it space ambulances or Davina McCall. Well, her mother was an NHS worker found via Roger Ap Gwillim's DNA testing in the future. And the whole reason Sutekh kept the Doctor and Ruby alive was because he was so invested in this storyline. So after making it snow with her emotions, after being untraceable up until the last minute, basic DNA testing prevails, and her mother is on the NHS database and she's an ordinary person. Also, the father's around. We never mentioned that. What this communicates to us, the audience, is that to Russell T Davies writing this show, the big resolution to the mystery of what does 2 + 2 equal is 73. And that's not clever, that's not even misleading, that's just stupid. And then there's contradictions on top of contradictions that will never be explained, such as Ruby's mother pointing at a sign to name her. Empire of Death was a switching off point for a lot of people, as they felt their interest had been taken for granted. Empire of Death showcased that this season of the show wasn't about telling a good story, but throwing as many unpredictable twists at the audience as possible, even if they had to completely bend logic in order to do so. And that just doesn't make for a compelling ongoing series. It also retroactively ruins the rest of the series because Ruby Sunday's character is so tied to these resolutions. Why should we invest in these mysteries if they're just going to either kick the can down the street like Mrs. Flood, or be resolved in ways that reinvent their own rules at the last minute? It actively punishes proactive viewership. The only good you can get out of this is as a purely passive viewer. And now it's like, yeah, why should I care about the next Doctor, knowing that they might not get to see the ending of their own arc? Knowing that they could set up reunions with characters that just never materialize? Knowing that even just the Doctor meeting the Daleks isn't even a guarantee? Chapter 8. The weird morality system. So yeah, I could get into the weird morality system of the show when it comes to its political leanings, and how Ncuti Gatwa's era ultimately betrays the progressive stance it initially seeks to take, even down to having Conrad the Conservative get the happiest possible ending after being told his ideal world was nice by Ruby, who spent a lot of time in the disabled slums. Now again, I can see what the script is setting out to do here. Imply that Conrad is the way he is because he's unhappy. The problem is, I think for this to work, we needed to lean more into the traditional values that a lot of conservatives hold, rather than the more aggressive inequities for the disabled, trans people don't exist, and here's a lot of homophobia. If we'd just transformed it into a traditionalist utopia and omitted those elements, or at least not made Ruby so aware of them, this could work better. But also, Conrad killed a guy, and he gets the happiest ending of the bunch, told his ideal world is a nice place, and the reality that he chose for Belinda, the Doctor agrees with, so we got two dudes dictating what this woman does with her child. Well, I tell you what, Ted Cruz would fucking love the Doctor. But I've already made a whole video on the weird political skewings of this era that I think holds up just fine. So I'll just advise that you watch that when you get the chance. But make no mistake, this era that begins with posturing about how male-presenting Time Lords can't let go of things concludes with the Doctor regenerating after basically admitting that Conrad the Conservative had a better life in mind for Belinda than the one she'd lived up until now, so Belinda can go be a trad wife. So to those few scholars who called me a quote-unquote grifter because I criticized this show, I think you might be showing your ass a bit by defending it. Also, I thought the problem with grifters was the far-right propaganda. and not just speaking negatively about the show. Your priorities. Chapter 9. The conclusion. It's not like Ncuti Gatwa had no good episodes. The Church on Ruby Road was a solid start. Boom is a great bit of Doctor Who. Dot and Bubble was great. Lux was a great time. The Well doesn't hold up as a sequel to Midnight in the slightest, but it's functionally and serviceably a solid story. The story and the engine is easily the best showcase of the 15th Doctor, and that's really it. 6 episodes that range from above average to pretty strong. But sadly, these are not the stories I'll be thinking about when I think about this era. I just can't help but think about everything it failed to do. How the 15th Doctor has regenerated, and I have absolutely no idea where his moral compass leads. I have no idea what way 14's bi-generation actually serviced his character growth, and that's because the scripts reduced emotional maturity down to crying all the time. I don't feel satisfied with his stories or his companions. The bigger picture, where it counts the most, is irreparably fucked. And now that Doctor, the 15th Doctor, is sandwiched between David Tennant and Billie Piper. Yep, that'll do it.